What's going on, guys? Chip Happens 25. We're going to talk about fire safety. Let's get into it. Right. I'm really pumped, guys. I'm really pumped to be here. I'm really pumped to be on this podcast. I mean, it is my own podcast, but I'm just happy to be here, right? It's a good day. It's a good day. Today I'm finishing up some safety units, and I brought to my attention that a lot of people don't understand fire safety. So I want to take some time. I want to talk about at least a little bit about fire safety and how I teach fire safety to students. So moving on, my safety unit scales about 2 weeks in terms of how long it takes to get through it. We go through a basic understanding of accidents, how accidents happen, what to do in case of an accident, and then we go over basic OSHA related stuff. This includes safety colors, also PPE, proper protective equipment. This goes over a wide variety of stuff, but fire is the one part of this unit that I really love because we do some cool things. And I think when it comes down to students and when it comes down to working in a shop, fire safety is something that we really take for granted and we don't really listen to. So when it comes down to fire safety and being safe with a fire, how do I teach students, right? And I want you to ask yourself that question maybe. How you teach your workers about fire safety, how you be safe when there's a fire. Well, I've kind of touched on this a little bit in the past when I talked about safety units and I talked about how I deal with safety, how I talk about safety, but I want to talk about fire safety in particular, just because it's fresh in my memory and I'm kind of already, going through, the rounds with that. So when I talk about fire safety, I immediately talk about the repercussions that come from fires. When we talk about the shop and we talk about the agricultural shop in general, there is a huge risk of fires. The amount of chemicals I have in terms of paints, paint thinners, acetone, all this stuff, it's extremely flammable material. Much less I got wood and sawdust to worry about. I also have these chemicals that can be used to create a fire. Plus, fire like wood, like where you take a piece of wood and you take a torch and you burn the wood. Burned wood is very, very popular, and that increases the risk of fire in the shop. So I think when it comes down to fires and when it comes down to students wanting to do these cool projects, they need to understand a little bit about how a fire works and about how a fire, or what to do in a fire, I should say, right? What to do if there is a fire. After I talk about the fire risk, I talk about what a fire is itself. Now, a fire triangle is what's been used to describe a fire since, probably the beginning of time. But unfortunately, a fire triangle isn't necessarily the best illustration of a fire. It's more like a fire tetrahedron. Like there's so much more it goes into a fire. But to make it easy for students, we talk about just the basic fire triangle. There is 3 things that need to happen in order to start a fire. Now, a fire is started with fuel, oxygen, and heat. You need those 3 things. If you remove one of those 3 things, then a fire does not happen. If you remove 2 of those 3 things, then there's no fire. So heat would be kind of what we consider going to be that spark. Let's talk about fuel though. Fuel is going to be gasoline, something that is combustible. Few exceptions to these are like water and stuff. I mean, water technically could be combustible, but it really doesn't light on fire. It just boils away and turns into steam. But everything has some sort of point where it may lit on fire. And fuel is those things. If we talk about wood or trash, that's fuel, right? You need something to spark a fire, something to provide heat that brings the temperature of the fuel up to its ignition point, right? And then it needs oxygen to maintain or sustain the fire. So once we understand that, then we can understand how to actually get rid of a fire once it starts. Now let's talk about the base or the introduction of fires. As a kid, we all learned this basic thing: stop, drop, roll, water. We see on TV, water, firefighters use water to get rid of fire, that sort of thing. But the issue becomes, what happens when water doesn't work, right? What happens when water does not work? And so that's what we need to talk about. If we're talking about a trash fire, water is perfect to get rid of a trash fire. That is a Class A fire. A Class B fire are things like fuel, oil, gasoline, that sort of thing, right? And this fire is unique. I don't know if you ever tried this, but I always tell my students, think of like a fancy Italian restaurant where they give you oil and vinegar to dip your little bread in. I love oil and vinegar. It's like one of my favorite things. But you notice they don't really mix. I mean, everyone's always tried to mix them, but they don't really mix very well. Same thing with water and oil or water and gasoline. They don't mix. So if you were to dump water on that fire, what would happen is the gasoline would naturally split apart to separate itself. And then these little molecules of fuel would spread out and would create kind of like an explosion effect, because these little molecules would then light on fire, which is a whole new problem that we need to talk about. So once that kind of explodes, then people panic and try dumping more and more water, and it just keeps it, expanding. Even when those little molecules are flying through air on fire, they're getting more oxygen as well. So it kind of creates a horrible little tiny fire triangles that go everywhere. Now, when we try to put out a fire, especially that fire, we need to break that chain reaction that happens when oxygen, heat, and fuel get together, right? We need to break that. Well, how are we going to break that? Well, it's very simple, very easy. The way we're going to break that is we're not going to use water. We know water doesn't work. We're not going to use a wet chemical because it has water in it, right? So we would use a dry chemical or some sort of foam to remove the oxygen, right? If we can't rid the fuel, if we can't get rid of the heat, then we need to get rid of the oxygen. Now, I simulate this with my kids all the time. When I go through fire and I do my fire unit, I always light something on fire. And I always use acetone, which is a light grade fuel. It still gets the same effect as fuel fires, but they're always blown away because I spray it with water and it flares up like I just described. But when I use water and keep spraying it with water, what happens is the fire goes out. And they're like, well, how can that be? Water cannot take out a fire, especially a acetone or liquid fire. Water doesn't work that way. How does that work? Well, it actually works very, very simple. Water can actually lower the temperature of the fuel. So if I'm lighting a piece of wood on fire and I doused it in gasoline, I'm spraying water on it, yeah, it's going to spark up and the gas is going to light on fire. But the wood itself, the temperature is so low that the fire goes out on the wood. Not saying you should dump water on a gas or gasoline fire. I'm just saying that's kind of what happens, right? You should be able, or you should go and dump some sort of chemical on it, and that will kind of fix your problem. A dry chemical, I should say. But when it comes down to using foam, that sort of stuff, it doesn't work with electrical fires. Now, obviously, you do not want water or any sort of liquid around electrical. That's the reason why foam, wet chemicals just don't work. In order to kind of figure out or remove an electrical fire, you need to think about electricity itself. Electricity has the ability to shock you if you are using water in conjunction with that electricity. And it's not even necessarily the water, it's all of the dirt, grime, minerals, material inside the water that actually affects you, right? It's not necessarily the water itself. It's just the effect of the water upon yourself. Now, to put that in perspective, to kind of think about that a little bit different, it's magnesium, ammonium silicate, and it looks like just phosphate, essentially what it is, right? Ammonium sulfate and phosphate. There's also nitrogen. You may wonder, what in the actual heck is nitrogen doing in this thing? I thought gases don't work on electrical fires, and we're taught that CO2 doesn't work as well on electrical fires compared to other things. Well, nitrogen is a little bit different. Nitrogen is not actually the agent that's going to be putting out the fire. It's what's going to be pushing up those chemicals, pushing up those dry powders and putting them onto the fire. So when we have a electrical fire, we would have to make sure we're using the right fire extinguisher, right? You don't want to put any sort of wet foam on there or chemical. It's just going to cause more harm than good. Now, my experience with fires in this shop has been quite telling. I mean, my first time here, I was going through the shop cleaning up, and I decided, I'm like, you know what? I don't really know where these or what these electrical plugs go to, like what breaker they go to, so I'm gonna need to figure it out. So I started flipping them on, seeing what turns on. I flipped one on, and a huge arc of electricity comes out, and I was like, what the freaking hell is that? And so I thought I was dreaming, so I asked my coworker, I'm like, hey Chris, come over here, check it out. Flip it on again. He flips it on again, and he's like, oh dude, that's on fire, and there's like literally smoke and black coming up out of the plug. So I'm like, oh man, what do we do? So I run over and grab a fire extinguisher, and I blow out the fire, and I quickly get that fixed, right? But it was still crazy, and that was one of my first experiences with fire. I've had multiple other experiences. I've had these old plugs in my shop. I mean, I have the plug right in front of me, but it's very weird. I believe the actual wall plug comes from about the 50s, maybe 60s, right? And it's a very old wall plug, and someone kind of jerry-rigged it to accept a normal like NEMA plug, but I don't know, it's been wild ever since, and I've always kind of wondered why. But I know a lot of subs that came and subbed to my class have always been afraid of my office and the electrical in my office. So it's always been something that kind of strikes them with a little bit of fear, and I always kind of laugh a little bit, but it's still fun. It's still something that I always look back on and kind of laugh about. Yeah, I probably could have died, or probably could have burnt down the shop or something horrible, but it's something that still kind of, or it's something that's still kind of, I don't know. I like look back fondly upon it, I should say, right? But when it comes down to fires and knowing, I mean, I've had a lot of experience, especially with kids, not necessarily lighting kids on fire, I should should say, but dealing with fires and teaching kids about fires is pretty crazy. So we talked about Class A, Class B, Class C fires. There's always another one that we need to kind of talk about, and that is a Class D fire, and that involves metal fires, so like lithium, magnesium, titanium. The problem is that these fires release so much energy, right? Metals react a lot faster with water than oxygen, so more energy is released, right? So if you put water on a fire, the fire just gets hotter or even explodes because the metal changes and explodes outwards. So a lot of carbon dioxide extinguishers are pretty ineffective, especially against titanium. So they use a lot of inner agents like a dry sand or dry powder to kind of break that chain reaction. The issue is a lot of cars and stuff are made out of magnesium, a lot of components, and when they light on fire, they go and you can't even look at them because they burn your eyes, and it's horrible. So once something is broken, right, just like a dry sand added to it, once some part of that fire triangle is broken, the combustion stops, all right? So we need to make sure we understand, and I need to make sure I tell my students, I need to understand how to stop a fire. And we take a look at a bunch of different things. We watch a lot of news articles on people trying to use fire extinguishers. We talk about the PASS method. In case you do not know how to use a fire extinguisher, is the PASS method is what is kind of accepted. So what you would do is you pull the pin, it's P, pull the pin. A is for aim, to aim the fire extinguisher. The first S is for squeeze, you squeeze the trigger. Then the second S is for sweep, and you would sweep side to side. Now here's the deal. When it comes down to using the fire extinguisher, we need to make sure that we are sweeping from side to side from the bottom up. I cannot tell you how many kids go from the top down because they see the flames reaching the top and they're like freaking out, wondering what's happening, right? Wondering what to do. And in reality, they needed to attack the actual thing that's on fire, not the fire themselves. Remember, you need to get rid of the fuel, heat, or oxygen. And if you're not aiming at the fuel, you're going to be pretty hard pressed to get rid of any of those two things. Now, one of the cooler things that I've seen are halon gases, and they're used to create like a barrier of gas in between like that chemical reaction. So it's a halon fire extinguisher, and it's just a bunch of gases. I actually don't know exactly what kind of gas. Oh, it's basically methane, right? So it's methane with some hydrogen atoms, and it creates a very sort of like a barrier of gas, right? So it's pretty cool. Now, fires are always a huge part, and we all, especially in California, we kind of have really mixed opinions and reactions. A lot of us are afraid of fires over here after going through all the stuff we've been through with fires. But just understanding the fire situation, just understanding where exactly we need to do, right, is pretty important in terms of fighting that fire. And it's pretty important that kids understand how to fight fires as well. Now, you may be wondering, and a lot of my students wonder, okay, well, if Class A fires are just wood and trash, why do we still use water to fight fires? Well, I tell them water can have two different roles. In case of a solid combustible, water could technically lower down the heat, right, and change the temperature of whatever is going to be on fire and break one part of the fire triangle. Water is also pretty easily evaporated, so I've always wondered too, until I've talked to a cousin who is a firefighter, I've always wondered why they dump water on fire. Like the fire is just going to evaporate it. Well, that is an energy source, right? If you dump water on it, the water has to be evaporated, and it changes the temperature around the fire because the fire is using energy to evaporate the water and consume oxygen. So if you are lowering the air around it, the temperature of the air, then you would make that mixture non-combustible. The same kind of thing goes for gas or oil fires. Yeah, you put water on it and it kind of spreads it, makes it go more, but you are also lowering the temperature around that gas, making it non-combustible, right? So in firefighting, they basically call this gas cooling or smoke cooling. So they use that water vapor to make that area non-combustible. It's kind of wild. I'm not a firefighter, nor do I understand the effects of fires and firefighting. I'm just a teacher, and I just teach my kids just the bare minimum basics. And I've always liked to learn and figure out a little bit about fires and how fires actually work. I believe wildland firefighters and wildland fires use a different type of fire triangle. Like they're on like a graph. It's kind of like a multi-scale. It's kind of wild, but the fire triangle is pretty evolving and something we've always tried to really nail down. And it's something we should all spend time teaching to our children, our students, students, our workers, they should understand how a fire works, understand what to do in a fire. I show videos of people reacting to fire, and it's always panic. And I can understand. It's a traumatic experience being in a fire. But you shouldn't panic. And I know it's easy to say right now because you're not in the middle of it. But the panic should be extremely low. You should not panic about being in a fire. You should not panic about a fire even happening. You should be able to react. And that's kind of what I really focus on teaching students, is how to react to something, right? What is the appropriate way to react? And I think at the end of the day, if there's an accident, I would want students reacting appropriately instead of freaking out and panicking, because then that's just going to cause more and more problems. Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to Chip Happens. All of your support really means the world to me. I would encourage you to follow me on Twitter @Chip Happens so you can get some updates, maybe interact with me, that sort of thing. Next week, I got a pretty exciting episode. Slowly, things are going to be changing. I have new equipment inbound that will be here at the end of the month. So you'll hear a little bit of a different kind of sound in the podcast. I also have some interviews set up, and I'm very excited for what is coming. Chip Happens episode 25 is in the books. I appreciate every single one of you. See you guys later. Peace. This has been an episode of the Chip Happens podcast. Thank you all for listening, and I will catch you next week with another exciting episode.